They thought their loyal dog had turned into a killer the night their little boy died. In grief and anger, they cast him out into the freezing cold. But when an officer uncovered the truth, the family realized they hadn't lost just a child, they'd nearly lost an angel too. Before we start, make sure to hit like, share, and subscribe. And really, I'm curious, where are you watching from? Drop your country name in the comments. I love seeing how far our stories travel. The Johnson household was always alive with laughter. At its center was 7-year-old Ethan, a boy whose boundless energy filled every corner of their home. From the moment the sun rose, his small feet would patter across the wooden floors, chasing dreams, adventures, and sometimes mischief. But wherever Ethan went, his loyal German shepherd, Max, was never far behind. Max wasn't just a pet. He was Ethan's shadow, protector, and partner in every game. Whether it was racing through the backyard, curling up with storybooks, or falling asleep with tiny hands buried in thick fur, the bond between boy and dog was unshakable. Neighbors often smiled, saying they were like two halves of one soul. For Ethan's parents, watching their son grow alongside such a devoted companion brought comfort. They believed nothing could break the trust between boy and dog. But fate was already preparing a storm. It was a chilly autumn afternoon when the laughter inside the Johnson home fell silent. Ethan had been playing in the living room, Max curled faithfully at his side. Moments later, a piercing cry shattered the calm. By the time his parents rushed in, Ethan lay motionless on the floor. Panic surged through the house. His mother dropped to her knees, shaking him, calling his name with trembling sobs. His father dialed emergency services, his hands barely able to steady the phone. But nothing seemed to stir the little boy awake. Max barked frantically, circling Ethan, his paws scraping the floor as if begging for someone to understand. In the chaos, a terrible sight caught the parents' eyes, blood smeared across the dog's muzzle and fur. Shock twisted into horror. They froze, unable to comprehend the unthinkable thought forming in their minds. Their son was gone, and Max was to blame. The Johnsons' living room became a scene of heartbreak. Ethan's small body was carried away by paramedics, his mother clinging to him until the last possible moment, her cries echoing down the street. His father stood frozen, fists clenched, staring at Max with eyes full of grief and fury. Neighbors gathered outside, whispering. As the ambulance pulled away, Max sat at the doorway, ears low, tail still. He didn't understand the chaos, only that his boy was gone. He whined softly, inching toward Ethan's parents, but was met with a sharp cry from the mother. "Get away from me." Grief twisted into blame. Every glance at Max reminded them of blood and loss. The father's voice broke as he spoke. He was supposed to protect Ethan, not. His words trailed off, but the conclusion was clear. Through their tears, they made a devastating choice. The once beloved dog, who had been part of their family, was now seen as a monster. That night, with hearts shattered and judgment clouded by sorrow, the Johnsons decided Max could no longer stay. What they didn't know was that in casting him out, they were also casting out the truth. The night was bitterly cold, snowflakes drifting down in silence as the Johnsons drove far from town. Max sat in the back of the truck, tail thumping nervously, unaware of what awaited him. When the vehicle stopped on a deserted road, the father's trembling hands unlatched the door. "Go," he whispered hoarsely, his voice breaking. Max hesitated, ears twitching, eyes searching for Ethan. But there was no boy, only the sharp sting of the wind. The father forced him out, then turned away before the dog's gaze could pierce his heart any deeper. Max stood in the snow, confused, watching the red taillights fade into the darkness. He barked once, twice, and then whined, but the truck never returned. Curling into himself against the icy wind, he waited, faithful as ever, believing that, sooner or later, his family would come back for him. News of Ethan's sudden death spread quickly through the small town. Whispers of the tragedy reached Officer Daniels, a man known not only for his sharp instincts but also for his deep love of animals. When he heard the story, that the family's own dog had been cast out as the killer, something didn't sit right with him. Daniels visited the Johnson home the next morning. The air inside was heavy with grief. Ethan's mother sat silently, her eyes red and swollen, while his father retold the events in a hollow voice. "The dog had blood on him," he said firmly, though his words trembled. The officer nodded but didn't answer immediately. He glanced at the empty space where Max's bed once lay, then back at the parents. His gut told him the story was incomplete. Loyal dogs rarely turned violent without cause, and Daniels had seen enough to trust his instincts. "I'd like to examine the scene myself," he said at last. The parents exchanged weary looks, but offered no objection. For them, it was already decided. But for Daniels, it was the beginning of a search for truth, a truth he suspected was far more complicated than grief allowed them to see. Officer Daniels walked slowly through the Johnsons' living room, his sharp eyes scanning every detail. The broken toy car near the couch, the faint trail of blood droplets leading not from Max, but toward the doorway. Kneeling, he traced the floor with his gloved hand, noting the small puncture wound visible on the rug's stained edge. "This isn't a dog bite," he murmured to himself. He stepped outside, following Rex's frantic paw prints preserved in the fresh snow. They circled, scratched, dug at the ground as though the dog had been desperate to draw attention to something. Daniels crouched lower and found it, faint marks leading toward a gap under the porch. Coiled, there was the frozen body of a venomous snake, its fangs bared even in death. The realization struck like lightning. Ethan hadn't been mauled. He had been bitten. Max's muzzle stained with blood wasn't guilt, but proof of his desperate attempt to drag the boy to safety. Daniel's heart pounded. The family, blinded by grief, had condemned the very one who tried to save their child. Standing tall, he knew what he had to do: bring Max back and bring the truth with him. That evening, Officer Daniels returned to the Johnsons' home. The parents sat in silence, their grief thick and unyielding. Ethan's mother clutched a small sweater to her chest, while his father stared into the fireplace, his face hollow. Daniels removed his hat, his voice steady, but gentle. "I need you to listen carefully," he began. He laid the evidence on the table. The snake's remains sealed in a bag, photographs of the puncture wound, and the trail that told a different story. "Your son wasn't harmed by Max. He was bitten by this snake. Max tried to save him." The room went utterly still. Ethan's mother's hands trembled, the sweater slipping from her grasp. His father blinked rapidly, struggling to absorb the words. "You mean all this time?" Daniels nodded. "Your dog wasn't the cause of tragedy. He was the only one fighting against it." Tears spilled freely down Ethan's mother's face as she buried her hands in her lap. The father covered his mouth, shaking his head in disbelief. The crushing weight of guilt filled the room. In their grief, they had banished not a killer, but their son's truest guardian. The next morning, Officer Daniels drove out along the deserted road where Max had last been seen. Snow crunched under his boots as he called softly, "Max, come here, boy." From the shadows of a nearby barn, a faint whimper answered. The German shepherd emerged, thin and shivering, yet his eyes still held that same unwavering loyalty. Daniels knelt, opening his arms. Max bounded forward, pressing against him with a desperate whine, as though begging to be taken home. With gentle hands, the officer lifted him into the truck and drove straight to the Johnsons. When the door opened, Ethan's mother collapsed to her knees. Tears streamed as Max pressed his head into her arms, forgiving instantly. The father stood behind her, eyes wet, whispering, "We're so sorry, boy." The family embraced him tightly, realizing their greatest mistake. They had lost their son, but they would never again abandon his protector.